Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining this session of the Technical Empowerment Series. Today, we have Ashwin Ramdas, who is the CTO of DeliverZero.
This is the 27 Degrees Technical Empowerment Series, brought to you by SADA's Office of the CTO.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be
Yeah,
here.
awesome. Just brief introduction. Just tell us and the viewers just who you are, what you're working on, and where you're at right now with your journey.
Yeah, so my name is Ashwin Ramdas. I'm the CTO of DeliverZero. DeliverZero is a reusable takeout container service. So we partner with restaurants and we stock them with reusable takeout containers so that when you are ordering takeout and delivery, you have the option to get your food in reusable containers rather than single use. And what we do is we've created a system where you can return the containers get sanitized, and then actually get reused so that we're creating a closed loop so that there's no single-use waste as a result of you getting takeout. So it's kind of our goal is to, let you continue getting the convenience and the takeout that you love, but without all the single-use waste that um, is harming our planet. I'm the CTO. I joined DeliverZero in August of 2021. I had been working in the circular economy space for several years, mostly on like the business side and operational side of things. But about a year and a half ago, I realized that there was a huge gap in the technical abilities with regards to reuse systems. Like there's so much automation and there's so much manual efforts in reuse systems that existed, and I realized that a lot of these things could be automated to make reuse more scalable and accessible to bigger businesses and bigger restaurant chains and delivery platforms and such. So then I started working on that, connected with DeliverZero, and became CTO shortly after that. So um, that's how I got here.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because you mentioned some of the things around waste and especially in cities, and being in New York myself, and especially especially as we went through the lockdown phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that one of the big things personally, at least for me, that I saw was the increased dependence on takeout containers, and just sort of seeing, even when you just walk along the streets, just the sheer amount of waste that creates. And
Hmm.
it's tough because it's not, given the circumstances in 2020, 2021, it's not like you can't not use containers of some sort, but it's one of those like, oh, there must be a better way kind of moments that really stuck out.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I approached it too. Like I have been an environmentalist my essentially my whole life. I at different times in my life, I was passionate about different environmental topics, but plastic pollution was kind of the forefront of my uh, passions when I visited India in like 2016, and I saw how specifically single-use food packaging waste had kind of devastated the old villages that my parents grew up in and that my grandparents currently live in. These once picturesque villages had essentially turned into landfills because of single-use food packaging waste. And so when I came back, I started to look at my own consumption practices, and I saw, for most aspects of my life, I was able to cut out single-use waste, except when it came to food. And, it kind of seemed like we had all just settled on the idea that single use is it. There was no other way to do it. You had to package it in plastic, and that's the only way you can get food from point A to point B. And coming from India, where they have tiffin systems and already have these reuse systems ingrained in, or at least used to be ingrained in the culture. It's gone towards you know single use now too, but um, I knew it was possible. Like it was possible to have reuse systems. It didn't have to be like this, and we just had to make those reuse systems as easy to use as single use, as quick to use, and as scalable as single use waste is, and then it can actually replace single use. It's a hard problem to solve, but we're starting to crack away at it. But yeah, it's a daunting issue. Like you see it everywhere. I can't imagine in New York. Like I live in Colorado, and takeout's big here, but I can't imagine in New York how much single use waste you see. Especially, it seems like most restaurants there are our single use or like our takeout first restaurants.
Yeah, and then you add the prevalence of things
Yeah.
like ghost kitchens and deliver only places, and just the problem becomes compounded. And
Yeah.
yeah, just it if something like reusable containers was more popular, if the adoption was higher than it already is, like I think it would make a huge help. So I'm glad you're all doing this
Yeah.
work. In short, yeah.
Thanks.
Um,
Yeah, we think it's a worthwhile mission. And like it's like we know the problem. The problem is not invisible. We all kind of know it's a problem. Yet at the same time, these services are exploding. So it's kind of like while we know this is a huge issue, we're allowing it to get way worse in an accelerated fashion. So we're hopeful we can put a
yeah.
dent into that.
Well, so when as you're going out and building, as you're going out and building the solution that you're all working on at DeliverZero, I'm curious if you look back in the last few years, especially with the high pace of cloud innovation and the different tooling and the different capabilities that cloud platforms are giving, when you're in especially in the context of the aspect of the circular economy that you're trying to address, as well as for smaller organizations in general. What are some of the, if you could comment on some of the overall trends and shifts that you've seen in the last few years? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it from like the sustainability industry's perspective. I think there's been a huge recent growth in green tech recently. A lot of problems, these are problems that have been around for a while, but they've never been approached from the technical solutions. Like, mostly because there was a pretty big barrier to entry, I think, in to get into tech, and I think cloud services, specifically Google Cloud platform, has made it super easy to get started and to like access all of these technical services that one before felt very ambiguous and kind of cryptic, but now that they're very easy to access. And so, like for example, I wasn't a technical person until about 2 years ago, and I had a solution that I wanted to see, and I knew I had to build a technical infrastructure to get there. And you know, I looked at different services, and when I landed on GCP, it was just like, wow, this is just so clean. It's so easy. Like I just have to read these docs, and then I can actually build this from the ground up. I don't really need to start off big. I can just build these small, um, the small ecosystem, and then it can grow from there. And I think cloud services has made it very easy to uh, for people like me and for people in the green industry who probably haven't had as technical uh, education as most people in tech, and so we can actually uh, we don't need that technical education. We can get started pretty easily, and the barrier to entry is much lower, I think, to getting a grasp of how to implement all of these solutions and how to um, yeah
Yeah,
how to
simple.
build the technical infrastructure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
simple is, we like simple, I think, especially when trying
Yeah.
to build something new. Like if it's so complex from the get go, just no one's ever going to use it. So I'm glad that it's accessible. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, and it's very accessible, and that's like huge because in the green tech industry is just like bubbling on the surface. There's just like a lot of solutions that are finally looking towards tech to make things more scalable and more automated. A lot of these, like especially for us, like the biggest issue that we have, or like historically why reuse systems fail, is because it's as simple as you can't get the containers back to reuse them. That's the simplest reason why um, some of these reuse systems fail. And so how do you get those containers back? Historically, it was a very manually intensive process where you had to like, or you charge, yeah, it was either manually intensive where you had to like manually track all these containers in like this, a convoluted spreadsheet or something, and then you had to like somehow get the customer to compel the customer to give you back the container. Historically, that was a very manually intensive and just operationally intensive process, or you had to charge really large deposits, which kept um, some people out of the system because it's a financial barrier to entry. But using tech for us, it has made it extremely easy now for us to track the containers as they're going from the restaurants to the customers. We're able to compel the customers to give back the containers through our technical suite. Uh, we're kind of like a library system where if you don't return a container, you get charged as if you get charged a late fee as if it was like a Blockbuster video or a library book. A Blockbuster is probably not a great example, a great
I was about to say
analogy to
that's a
make,
name I
but
haven't heard in a long time.
yeah, they're not the pinnacle of tech, I guess. But uh, yeah, it has made it a lot easier for us to implement um, this environmental solution that can actually grow and live in our current um, world of convenience and the current economy as well. Like we're able to keep our costs much lower now because it's a lot less manually intensive than it used to be, and we're able to integrate with other platforms who have a larger reach and who can actually make the solution explode.
Yeah, so it sounds like some of the key, the key differences, quote unquote, sort of this time around, if I were to phrase it, it sounds like cloud's lowering costs, it's making development easier, it's making the integration easier. I You also touched upon some of the longer standing reusable container system, just the meal delivery systems in India. I remember when I grew up in South Korea, and Asia in the 80s and 90s was a developing time, so it's not a flawless time. But the back in Korea, there still was this idea of reusable containers. They would deliver food to you, and then they would come pick it up later. Um, and when you're talking about building these platforms that are going to help incentivize people, lower the barrier to people taking place in the system. I'm just curious, like what do you think this time around, especially in America, like how do you see this going differently? Like what do you think is going to change that is going to increase adoption in these systems, and where do you see this going?
The like we live in a culture of convenience, so convenience has to be the number one uh, topic at the forefront of our minds whenever we're building our solution. Like, how is this going to be like the current system is extremely convenient for restaurants and consumers. The restaurant puts food in a box, sends it out. They don't think twice about it. The user gets food delivered to them, and then they don't have to do anything else. They eat the food. That's it. That's the end of the interaction. So we need to get our system to be as uh, to mimic that system or to mimic the current system as much as possible so that we're not adding any additional work to the restaurant's plate. We're not adding additional work to the user's plate as much as we can get away with. So building around convenience is what's going to make it different because, like in Korea and in India, if someone has to come by, an hour later to pick up the containers from you, that's a huge cost and a huge operational lift for the restaurant. Um, so we have to get around that. And the way we're doing that is uh, we're integrating with those different courier systems that can help us pick up the containers from customers' restaurants so that there's no additional work for the restaurant. There's actually no additional work for the couriers either because we're using empty legs and empty routes to actually pick up those containers from consumers. And so integrating with the convenience that people are already used to and not adding any additional inconveniences to their life is how we're going to get this adoption, how we're going to get adoption up, and how we're going to really grow the solution um, to the next level. We're relying on tech for all of that. Like we're gathering so much data about where these containers are going, where they need to get picked up from, how we can drop those points of pickup into existing um, courier routes so that we're not adding any additional miles, we're not adding any additional time to the system, um, and that's the only way we can really scale this to exist in our current culture of convenience.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting you touch on that because I I'm a data engineer by training and by career, so of course I'm always going to bring everything back to data because that's
Yeah,
just how I view the world, sort of selfishly. But
yeah,
if I think about a lot of these manual systems where at best people are tracking these in a spreadsheet, like you mentioned,
Right.
people are trying to infer trends by hand, especially difficult if you're doing this in a ledger that's on paper in a notebook somewhere. So I think
Yeah,
having all this in digital form in a database somewhere makes a
exactly.
huge amount of difference, right? You can see
Yeah.
where people are using it, where they're not, where to target next, and so on and so forth. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And then you can visualize the data really easily, especially for us, because like a lot of it is map based. We have our different nodes on a map where customers can get containers, and we have different nodes on the map where customers can return containers. And we need to know like where the containers are actually physically going so that we can say, all right, here's where we can intercept those containers to actually pick them up and return them to the restaurants without adding any additional cost and additional miles. And being able to visualize all of that data that we've captured is so much easier for us to interpret than what we were doing before, where we were just kind of like saying, we think that's a high trafficked area. Let's put a box there or a drop off bin there. It's like, no, we're using data to actually drive our decisions now.
Yeah, it's actually being data driven for once,
There you go.
which
Exactly.
is.
Yeah.
I'm switching tacks for a little bit. I'm just curious around uh, your thoughts on any overarching trends that you've seen in the intersection of the circular economy uh, as a whole,
Hmm.
and how you think technology is really changing it this time around. Because
Yeah.
again, the ideas of reuse is not inherently new, but the landscape is new,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The name of the game is tracking. It's about tracking the containers. It's about knowing where they're going and knowing when they're coming back, and compelling the customer to bring them back. That's that's where tech has revolutionized circular economy and reuse systems. Like we were saying before, you couldn't track the containers, or you could. It's very manually intensive. You had this stupid spreadsheet trying to track all these containers, or you charged really massive deposits, which turned away customers. And now it's all about being able to track containers as they're going out and coming back in, and tracking them in a way that is as manually hands off as possible. Like, you know, DeliverZero. So my I used to run a company that was very similar to DeliverZero in Colorado that merged with DeliverZero just recently. That company was called Repeater. We're now uh, basically one team now with DeliverZero. So DeliverZero is now in New York and Colorado as a result. And but prior to when I first started Repeater in Colorado, we were doing QR systems and or QR codes and potentially RFID tracking of these containers, but um, that was kind of before we really had much of a grasp on the restaurant industry. And we just thought, oh, QR codes, yeah, the restaurant could just scan a QR code on a container before they hand it out, and that's how we track the containers. It's
Like, oh, how hard could it be,
right,
right?
yeah, it's a technical solution. It makes things automated. We're able to track all this data that we need to track. But then in practice, in the restaurants hated it. Restaurants were like, I packed 12 boxes for this one customer and I have to scan each individual box. That's going to add so much time. Like, so much time might be like 20 seconds to the restaurant's flow, and that's already too much. Like, their margins are so small. They're already so operationally, and their major cost is labor. And so if we're adding any amount of labor to their plate, it's kind of a non-starter. And so we moved away from a QR system, and now we've gone through a couple iterations, and now we're developing an API that actually is able to attribute boxes to customers as they place their order without the restaurant having to manually tell us anything, without the user having to manually tell us anything. And so that's like kind of the evolution that we've seen in circular economy, and we believe we're like the leaders in building the tech around circular economy, like in building this API that's able to create this essentially a touchless system in the real world. Like, the restaurant doesn't have to tell us, yeah, like I just said, the restaurant doesn't have to tell us anything, the customer doesn't have to tell us anything, and we're still able to capture the data that we need to capture to track all of these containers, and to compel customers to return the containers. Um, so yeah, it's about how do we capture that data in the most or in the least manually intense way as possible. And we think we're getting there. And that's really the only way that this specific solution can grow. And most solutions in the green economy, because like a lot of tech or a lot of sustainability um, solutions so far have been like asking the customer to make all these pretty big behavioral changes. Um, and that's not really a viable, a scalable solution. Like asking each individual person to make uh, such a energy intensive behavioral change and it is kind of not really good to scale, especially not quick enough to at to keep up with the pace of climate change. So we need to make solutions that don't require behavioral change as much as possible, and that's really what we're trying to build here, and that's how. And tech has really revolutionized that because we can make things really convenient. We can make things super automated now. We can take a lot of the manual labor off of different parties' plates so that they are able to engage us in the solution without having to, make those big behavioral or operational changes.
Yeah, that's really the easiest way to increase adoption, right? Just make it so it's
Yeah,
seamless and you barely even notice
exactly.
that it's
It's like,
happening.
I like to think of companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. Instead of saying, "Hey, everyone stop eating meat," they're like, "Well, why don't we just take this thing that everyone already loves doing and just make it way better for the planet?" And so you
Right.
don't have to request this massive behavioral change from each individual person. You can meet them where they're at, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to meet people where they're at, integrate with the culture that they're already used to and the culture that they don't want to give up. Because asking people to give up a lot is just not going to work. It's just not going to be a practical solution.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, one of the one of the last questions I had for you is looking forward. If you were to look at technology in the circular economy as well as sustainability in a broader sense, what are what are some of the technologies that you see on the horizon that you're most excited about that you think will will have the most impact and influence the most change in your opinion?
Across the
Or
sustainability
whether
industry,
whether it's for your own company or whether it's for circular
yeah,
any aspect of it. Just curious what your general thoughts
yeah.
are.
For the circular economy, I think the I'm very heavily biased, but I think our API solution is going to revolutionize um, reusable packaging in the food industry specifically, in food service. I think because food service is a it's really its own thing. Like it's a different animal than most under other industries. It's the like the lowest margin industry, but the highest operational legwork. So building a solution that can integrate with that kind of industry is going to be um, it's going to be have to be that kind of a solution that can just seamlessly integrate. And we think we're building that with our API. And our API is we're developing it so that we can integrate with those third-party delivery platforms, the third-party online ordering platforms. There are already these behemoths where people go and place their orders for food. And if we're able to integrate our solution with those behemoths and just grab the data that we need as those orders are being placed, that's how we're going to really make the system scalable and accessible and you know really increase our reach too. Like it's one thing to have to get people to come to DeliverZero's website and find out about our reusable containers, but if they go to one of these third-party platforms where people are already ordering their delivery and takeout and then they see DeliverZero, it's like, whoa, that's a lot more reach than we could ever have if we're trying to do it on our own. So yeah, we think that in the circular economy space, I think that creating our API is going to revolutionize reusable food packaging in food service. Um, yeah, and there's a lot of I geek out on a lot of different sustainability tech across the industry, but um, for specifically for circular economy, I think that's going to be where the future needs to be.
And I'm excited for that because as a Manhattanite in New York, that's kind of tired of seeing these single-use containers littered about on the street. I am looking forward to a day when that's no longer the case.
Yeah, same
um,
here.
Yeah. With that, really want to give you the last word on this. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to spur people to sort of go off and learn more about sustainability and the circular
Yeah.
economy as a whole. So I mean, as people start to go down this journey, what's something you want to leave them with?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a very daunting issue. It's a very depressing and discouraging issue. So I would say first and foremost, just look at your own personal life and see where you can make a difference. See where you can realistically make a difference in your personal life. Like, you know, we all kind of know that single-use plastic is an issue. You can dive deep into why it's an issue, but you're probably just gonna get filled up with all this climate angst that it's probably not good for your mental health, honestly. Like most people in the sustainability world have have been there and have pretty intense climate anxiety. And I'd say, approach it in a way that where you can actually make a difference in your own life and feel like you have the power to actually make that difference. So if that means going to um, a local refill shop to refill your soaps instead of buying them in new single-use packaging, that's a huge difference that you can make. Um, so I'd say, yeah, look at your own personal habits, just see where you can get a little bit better, and then just try to do as much as you can. And don't blame yourself for the rest because it's not your fault. There are huge, um, monoliths in place that have created a system that is really causing the issues, and us as DeliverZero, we're trying to cut through that system and make a better solution. But in the meantime, just try to do what you can, and that's all we can ask for.
Yeah, as they say, shavings make a pile, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you for the time, and thanks for doing what you do. I'm excited to see where DeliverZero goes, and very, very excited to see, especially on the cloud, and how you leverage the technologies and see the kind of impact that you all make.
Yeah.
So, again, thank you for taking the time to speak with us, and to the viewers out there, thank you for listening in, and hope this conversation was valuable, and hope everyone goes out there and starts their own sustainability journey.
Well, yeah, I hope so too. Thanks, Brian, for having me.
Awesome. Thank you.